Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Paranormal Planet. I appreciate you tuning in this evening. Lots going on. We are possibly on the precipice of World War III. Who knows? I do know that the French president, Macron, spoke with Putin today, and apparently he reported back that there was no off ramp, that he simply was going to take the entire country. And that's what Putin had told him. So that's what you can expect. And where it leads from there, who knows? I often remind people that 2012 wasn't that long ago. And it takes a few years for things to get rolling, but the Mayans were probably right. That was probably the beginning of the season of change, which is now. So all of that's been happening. I'm sure you've been tuned into all of that. There's lots going on under the surface, and of course, uh, the first casualty of war is always the truth. And propaganda abounds. I'm amazed at how good some of their propagandists are. Um, and by that I mean pretty much all foreign countries at this stage, except for us. Seems like we're lacking quite a bit. I've got a really interesting and not so long show for you guys tonight. Pardon me while I wet my whistle. I've been thinking a lot about the previous episodes that I did discussing the OSAP program, the wide array of paranormal activity that they were studying, that was associated with the UFO activity that was being investigated by the ATIP program, both Pentagon programs. This is something I've covered quite a bit in the previous few weeks. So if you're kind of lost on that information, then you will find it in detail in those episodes. But I've been thinking about those findings, and it really occurred to me that Skinwalker Ranch is something that we should revisit and talk about in light of some of the things that were reported in the OSAP program and with Colm Kelleher in his book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. So let's take it back to the beginning. And by beginning in this particular case, I mean before Bob Bigelow bought the ranch. The family that lived there experienced profound UFO activity, cattle mutilations, and along with that, a wide array of paranormal activity. Um, in one particular occasion, the wife came home and she had unpacked all of her groceries. She turned around, went into another room for mere moments, returned, and all the groceries had been repacked into her bags. There were many cases where things would turn up missing and show up later. Objects would materialize out of thin air. There were orbs being reported constantly that was associated with that. And all of those things mirror exactly what the OSAC program was reporting. And that's very interesting because the chief officer, science officer during the time that Bob Bigelow owned it, is Colm Kelleher, and he's the same guy who helped write the first book on Skinwalker Ranch, Hunt for the Skinwalker, and then wrote about these findings in the OSAP program. And it occurred to me that the Skinwalker Ranch really is what Bob Bigelow came to decide at the end of their particular investigation, and that was his group, the NIDS, was that they simply concluded that they were interacting with a non-human intelligence, and that that area served as a perfect laboratory with which to study this non-human intelligence. They didn't know at that time that they would later have all of these studies with the OSAP program talking about the hitchhiker effect, and the fact that people who were or did have close encounters with UFOs or were a part of that program ended up taking paranormal activity back home with them. Profound paranormal activity, not unlike and almost exactly like that was reported by the Sherman family. So I think it is obvious, really, that we should draw a line, a conclusion that what they were seeing outside of the Skinwalker Ranch associated with the UFO activity in the form of this paranormal phenomenon was exactly what was being experienced at the Skinwalker Ranch, just in miniature form, if you will. There's various avenues of discussion, ideas, thoughts, and theories as to why that would be the case. I think it might be that the Skinwalker Ranch is, it might be the spot where this particular intelligence can communicate more easily, if you will, with humans. And we have to remember that this paranormal activity was, being reported by the indigenous people going back as far as they could remember, at a time when the Utes kicked them off the land, kicked the Navajo off the land, and then they put a Skinwalker witch put a curse on the land, and that's when, as far back as they could trace, when paranormal activity was taking place there. I would propose that it's highly likely that it was going on long before that, but it appears as though this intelligence kind of steps up its efforts to communicate along as we're kind of progressing. And it's something that I'm going to talk about tonight. Now, if we assume that it's the same force that the OSAP program was investigating than the Skinwalker Ranch program, then there's a couple of possibilities and probabilities that we can begin to play around with, think about, mull over, theorize, test, things like that. And that's how we make progress, right? So, first of all, the government was involved at Skinwalker Ranch really from the get-go, from the time that Bob Bigelow bought that ranch, and even up till today under Brandon Fugel's ownership, there have been intelligence agencies monitoring what was going on there, and that was even admitted on the television series. If you'll recall, the head scientist Travis admitted that he had been contacted by an intelligence agency and that they were monitoring what was going on the show, and then that was the show that they actually filmed an unmarked white plane flying over the property. I made the observation at the time that it's highly unlikely an intelligence agency would, announce that they were actually monitoring what was going on there, much less allow them to show that they were flying over and monitoring it. And of course, that's part of the disclosure. That's them highlighting that there's something big going on here, and we need you to guys kind of warm up to that idea, So we have a couple of different probabilities that occurred to me. One is the one that I discussed on a previous episode, where I talked about the possibility that the Earth has an innate, um, non-human, non-corporal, um, sentient intelligence that inhabits this planet along with us. And I argue that it may use the quartz crystal structures um, as its habitation. And the reason why is because if you look at all of these so called portal areas or vortex areas, they are all areas where there are vast deposits of quartz crystal. That could, of course, mean that these places are all portals, as I've discussed before, opened by the quartz crystal deposits. It could also mean what Terence McKenna would argue, maybe Carl Jung would argue, that this may in fact be um, kind of like what we consider the spirit of the planet, if you will, spirit of Gaia. I would be a little more pragmatic and less new age about that and say that science has always speculated that alien kinds of life form would be far uh, more different than we could imagine, and that the extreme likelihood that they would look anything like us, given our understanding of any kind of biological, procedures or interactions, just isn't there. So, is it possible that what we're looking at is what I call the crystal entity that is manifesting itself in all of these different ways in an attempt to communicate with us? Maybe it's kind of learning that process. It doesn't quite understand. Maybe it's trying to figure out what makes us react, what doesn't. Maybe it can read what we're fearful of, what we're not. Um, all kinds of avenues and doorways open up if you take that idea, not as gospel, of course, but the whole point of a theory is to be able to take that like a puzzle piece, plug it into what you know to be true, and see then if it simplifies the equation. Because if it simplifies it and everything begins to make a whole lot of sense, the likelihood that that is the rightful answer is greatly increased. So, the other theory that came to me, and it's interesting because you would kind of have to entertain the notion that that this is also kind of taking place, but it's not innate to the planet. In other words, I call this the Tommy knocker theory. So the other theory would be that there is some type of alien craft that is buried far beneath the Skinwalker Ranch, that's putting off all of these electromagnetic fields, that's sending out frequencies that are clearly communication frequencies, um, and that whatever alien life form is inside that craft is able to psychically communicate in that fashion outwards. That doesn't necessarily explain how people not associated with the ranch would end up exhibiting the same behavior, but we have to remember that the hitchhiker effect was something that was proven by that program, and Colm Kelleher is the connection between the two. In other words, if he had the paranormal virus, as we call it, he would have carried that into the program. It would have begun to spread to the other people. I would argue that the intelligence just begins to notice and then interact with the other people. Um, so there you would have sort of a spreading from the Skinwalker Ranch outward. But there again, you don't have complete understanding or symmetry with that, because you have a lot of research, for example, from Jacques Vallée. He wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, a book I read very early on in my investigation career. And it is a masterpiece of presenting all of the UFO cases that fit into the totally bizarre. Not like a UFO experience like we are used to hearing about, but very strange, sort of almost like fairyland kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like it, the aliens were described as far more fairy-like, and they would get out and they would share like these brown muffin type bread, and that was actually reported a huge number of times, and they're like, what are they feeding them, you know? But that book really encases everything that the OSAP program is talking about, as far as this connection between what we've always considered to be separate paranormal phenomenon, now appears to be connected to the UFO phenomenon. Again, that's all covered in previous episodes that I've done. Let me see what else I needed to. Oh, yeah. So the other thing that occurs to me is that if what we're seeing at Skinwalker Ranch is a non-corporeal intelligence, a non-human intelligence, as they put it in Hunt for the Skinwalker, we might be able to tell something about the nature of its personality and its attempt to communicate. A lot of things begin to make sense if you consider that that's an intelligence. For example, the episode with the bulls, where they leave, they've got all these prize bulls, they leave for a while, they come back, and all these 4 of these bulls have been stuffed into a tiny little trailer, just crammed into it, trailer locked, and the owners walked up and they were all in a trance-like state. There were incidents where the farmhands would be out there in their truck monitoring the cow herd, and the compasses inside the truck would start spinning, and then they would watch the cow herd part as though something was walking between them. They had security cameras that were physically messed with, but were in the sight of other security cameras that didn't record anything. That is kind of what we're talking about. That is an intelligence that is, outside the need for a physical body. That doesn't mean it's a ghost by a long shot. It means that, our scientists are probably correct, and what we're looking at is an alien intelligence, just not in any way, shape, or form like we expect one to show up and communicate like that. And with that, I'd like to also talk about, well, let's see here. Yeah, I'm going to finish up with an intriguing possibility. Let's say that something like the crystal entity exists, and that it has been interacting with humanity for a very long time. It is able to manifest itself as it wants, at will, by some choice, decision making that we don't understand. If you entertain that notion, a lot of things begin to make sense. A creature like that exists down in the earth could pretend to be, I don't know, ant people that come up and take the indigenous people down and guard and protect them during this horrible event that took place on the surface. Things like the crystal skulls. And let's talk about just a second the Mitchell Hedges skull. And the reason why is because there's more evidence for it being authentic than any of the others. If you read the full account by Anna Mitchell Hedges of how it was discovered and how she did look down and describes the whole thing of seeing, this crystal skull down inside the pyramid that her dad was working on, it rings true. I don't think there's a chance that Mitchell Hedges had that skull manufactured somewhere. And if you consider the idea of the crystal entity and that it's been communicating with humanity forever and maybe better with those who are in harmony with nature, maybe it sort of guided them into the construction of the crystal skulls and then used those as a better way to communicate. You see what I mean? It's rumored to have, I forget, 12 or 13 of these skulls, and if you bring them all together, apparently they speak. So maybe that's the trick, and maybe it needs all of them put together for that to happen. It's all just theories, ideas, things to think about as we go forward in this sort of new world of paranormal investigation. And one last thing. So in south central Colorado is a place called the San Luis Valley. It was a place that's described as a Disneyland of the paranormal. I did years of investigative research there. And what you have there is just sort of a larger version of Skinwalker Ranch, a wide array of paranormal activity, profound UFO activity. And at the southern end of the valley, a mountain called Mount Blanca. Mount Blanca is very important to the indigenous people of the Four Corners area. All of them consider it to be the holiest mountain, and they believe that the San Luis Valley is the place where they literally emerged into this existence. They call that emergence the Sipapu, and it's rumored to exist there in the valley. Some people believe that it is now Dollar Lake is what it's called. But that's significant because they have a rumor, all four of these tribes, that, and especially the Navajo and the Ute, that rock crystal boy and rock crystal girl reside within Mount Blanca. Nobody has ever been able to figure out exactly what that means. I think it's possible that because they found macaw feathers in Anasazi graves, that there was trade going on between the Mayan and North American tribes, and they could have somehow traded two of these crystal skulls that somehow made their way onto Mount Blanca, which would make sense since it's the holiest mountain. The other option would be perhaps they have an understanding of this entity. Maybe it exists in two different forms. So anyway, that's all I have for you guys tonight. Join me next week, and I'll have yet another interesting subject for us to delve into. I've got a really profound ancient mystery to kind of share with you guys, so we might do that. I will see you next week, same time, same place. Come by and see us at the website, paraintelagency.com. And until then, guys, keep your eyes